Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey into the past. Today, we will wander through the slow, often overlooked moments of history, the ones that shaped lives, ideas, and the world we know, quietly and without fanfare. Here, time moves gently. We will linger in workshops, libraries, and sunlit streets, following ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of patience and care. So find a comfortable place, let your mind settle, and allow the stories of centuries past to unfold, slowly, like pages turning under candlelight. This is boring past times for sleep where history whispers, and you can drift into the calm rhythm of the past. If you were to walk through a Yoruba village in southwestern Nigeria sometime around the late 19th century, the first thing that might reach you before the hum of voices or the rhythm of pestles in mortar would be the faint, earthy smell of fermentation. It was the smell of indigo, not the sweet, perfumed scent of a finished cloth, but the dense, living aroma of something growing and rotting at once. The slow, bubbling vats of dye that had been tended for generations. The Yoruba people were masters of a craft that was neither rushed nor loud. They made color out of patience. The art of dyeing cloth blue was not a spectacle, but a quiet habit, folded into the rhythm of ordinary life, like tending a garden or cooking a stew. The workshops where women worked were not factories in the modern sense, but shaded courtyards where time itself seemed to thicken in the humid air. In these courtyards, rows of earthen pits sat half-filled with dye, some freshly mixed and bright with leaves, others deep and dark with the matured indigo that could stain a hand for days. The women who tended them were called Alaro dyers of cloth, and they were often easily recognized by the tint of blue that stained their fingers, their aprons, and sometimes even the edges of their hair. That color was a mark of pride, though it was not spoken of as such. It was simply part of them. The indigo they used came from a plant called ilu, known in other parts of the world as Indigofera tinctoria. It grew like a modest weed, its small green leaves holding within them the potential for one of the world's most enduring dyes. But it was not the plant alone that made the Yoruba indigo so deep, so distinct. It was the method, the patience required to coax color from leaf and lye, from air and time, to prepare the dye. The women first gathered the leaves of the ilu plant. These leaves were pounded into a green pulp using wooden mortar and pestle tools that had darkened over years of use, their wood absorbing the scent of dye. The pulp was then soaked in clay pots with water and ash, sometimes mixed with old dye residue to teach the new batch the proper way to ferment. The mixture would sit under the sun for days, then weeks. As the leaves surrendered their color to the liquid, the transformation was invisible at first. The water remained murky green, and there was no hint of blue anywhere. Only after the leaves had been removed and the mixture allowed to ferment did a thin, oily film begin to shimmer on the surface, a promise of color that had not yet been born. The dyers would test it by dipping a small scrap of cloth into the vat and pulling it out again. It would emerge a dull green, not blue. Only when the air touched it did the magic begin. The oxygen turned the green to a deep, mesmerizing blue, as if the sky itself had been wrung into the fibers. This moment, when the cloth changed color before their eyes, never failed to bring a quiet satisfaction, even after a lifetime of seeing it. but no one clapped or exclaimed. The women simply nodded to one another, their faces calm, as though the miracle of color were as ordinary as the wind you might imagine. Standing at the edge of such a courtyard, hearing the soft splashing of cloth in the vats, the murmurs of women counting their dips, once, twice, 3 times up to 7 or even 9 immersions for the deepest blues. The rhythm of it was slow, deliberate, hypnotic. A cloth was never rushed. It had to breathe between each dip, exposed to the air so the indigo could bloom. Around the dye pits were walls plastered with red clay, their surfaces cracked with heat and age. On these walls, cloths hung to dry, each one bearing faint traces of patterns that would soon be revealed in fuller color. The sun, fierce and golden, bleached the air white, and the women worked beneath its weight with unhurried grace. Theirs was not a labor for spectacle, but for endurance. A good dyer was known not by her speed, but by her consistency, the steadiness of her hands, the balance of her mixture, the patience of her heart. There was an unspoken hierarchy among the dyers. The elder women, often called Iya Alaro, mothers of dye, supervised the younger ones, teaching through example rather than instruction. Apprentices learned by doing, by stirring, fetching water, folding cloth. A young girl might spend months simply watching how her teacher lifted a cloth from the vat, how she squeezed it gently to let the excess dye run off, how she read the color by eye. Words were few. The lessons were in the movement. At midday, when the heat grew heavy, work slowed. The women sat together on low stools, eating yams or drinking water tinged with the faint bitterness of fermented millet. Conversation drifted lazily between household matters, market prices, and gossip about distant towns. Yet always, someone's hands were still busy twisting a cord, folding a piece of fabric, or stirring the dye pit with a long wooden pole. Outside the courtyard, life moved on. Children played, traders called out in the market. Men passed with bundles of firewood or calabashes. But within the courtyard, time obeyed a different rhythm. The dye did not care for haste. If stirred too soon, it died. If left too long, it soured. The women understood this balance instinctively. Their work was not just a craft. It was a dialogue with time, air, and decay. The indigo cloths they made were not merely decorative. They were a language. Patterns were applied through techniques of resist diamost, famously adir iloko, where cassava paste was painted onto fabric to block the dye in intricate motifs. Some patterns represented proverbs, others family lineages, and some were created simply for their beauty. To the outsider, they might seem abstract or repetitive. To those who could read them, they spoke volumes. One common motif was called Olakon, the pattern of the sea goddess. Its rippling lines symbolized depth and mystery, a connection between earthly labor and divine creativity. Another was Iwa Peel, meaning gentle character, a reminder that beauty must come with patience and humility. In a way, the cloth itself was an embodiment of that lesson. Color achieved through slowness, strength born from waiting. At dusk, when the last cloths were hung and the vats covered, the courtyard would glow with the last warmth of the day. The blue-stained women would rinse their arms and faces at the water jar, laughing softly as the water ran green from their skin. They would fold the dried cloths carefully and store them in woven baskets lined with dry leaves to protect against insects. Then, with the work done, they would rest not with weariness, but with the calm satisfaction of having participated in something older than memory. The next morning, they would begin again. It is strange, perhaps, to think that such ordinary scenes, repeated daily in dozens of villages, could have shaped economies, rituals, and even identities for centuries. The Yoruba indigo tradition was not just about dye. It was about constancy. The same hands that turned green leaves into blue cloth also passed down the patience that built communities, sustained markets, and defined beauty itself. Even now, if you visit certain towns like Abeokuta or Ibadan, you may still find remnants of those courtyards, though many are silent. Some have been overtaken by concrete, others by the hum of modern machines that no longer require waiting or intuition. But here and there, an elderly woman might still sit by a clay pit, her fingers blue, her eyes half closed in concentration, the rhythm of her ancestors alive in her quiet motion. And if you were to ask her why, she continues why. In an age of synthetic dyes and factory-made cloth, she still stirs the old vats. She might smile faintly and say nothing. For how could she explain that the act itself is not merely to make color, but to keep time alive? The indigo, after all, never truly sleeps. If the dyeing pits were the heart of Yoruba indigo, the market was its pulse. Every few days, at dawn, the courtyards that had hummed quietly with the rhythm of dyeing would come alive with a different kind of music, wooden wheels creaking, baskets rustling, and voices rising like gentle waves. The dyers, wrapped in faded cloths of their own making, would load their indigo textiles onto their heads or into baskets balanced on hip and shoulder. Then they would begin the slow walk to market. The markets of southwestern Nigeria by Yokotwa, Ibadan, Oshogbo, and beyond were not just centers of trade. They were extensions of community life. For the indigo dyers, these markets were the places where color met value. The women who had spent days tending to vats and patterns came to negotiate their worth in coin, cowrie, shell, or barter. The cloth, now dry and neatly folded, was as much a statement of skill as it was a livelihood. Each cloth carried with it a story, not just in its design, but in the time invested in its making. Buyers knew this. They would feel the texture, examine the patterns, and sometimes sniff the fabric faintly, for the scent of fermented indigo lingered like memory. The best cloths had depth of blue, so dark it seemed almost to swallow light. A shallow blue, too hastily dyed, was easy to spot. It lacked patience, and patience was a currency of its own. There was a saying among the dyers, Uwo Alafia, the money of the dyer is peaceful money. It was slow to come, but when it came clean. Unlike traders in fast-turning goods, the dyers earned through endurance, not haste. Their profits were modest but steady, and their respect within the community was built not on wealth but on constancy. The economy of indigo was subtle. It extended far beyond the dye pits themselves. The men who harvested wood for ash, the potters who shaped the dye vats, the farmers who grew the ilu plants, and the women who sold starch for resist designs all participated in the chain of production. Even the refuse from dyeing spent leaves and ashwas, reused as fertilizer for crops or as scrub for washing floors. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the process fed another dot at the market. Transactions unfolded slowly. There was no rush. Prices were not shouted but murmured, negotiated through gestures and glances. A buyer might walk away, only to return an hour later when the heat had softened tempers. The indigo cloth was measured not in yards, but in layers and folds. Some buyers came for simple wrappers for everyday use. Others sought ceremonial pieces for marriage gifts or funerals. A full set of matching cloths, called Oshogbo, family cloth, could mark the unity of an entire lineage during celebration. It is difficult now, in an age of mechanical dyeing and synthetic pigment, to imagine how essential this slow commerce once was. Indigo was more than a color, it was a network of survival. A single courtyard could support not only the women who died, but the children who helped, the neighbors who shared firewood, and even the traders who carried the cloth to distant towns. In quiet ways, indigo connected the Yoruba world. There were guilds of dyers too, informal but respected. Older women often organized themselves into cooperative groups, sharing vats and ingredients, and setting standards for quality. A young woman could not simply begin dyeing and call herself an she had to learn under supervision, often as a relative or apprentice of an established dyer. Training could last years. The secrets of mixture, how to judge a vat's readiness by the film on its surface, how to rescue a sour batch with ash or palm wine were guarded knowledge. They were passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, in whispers and examples, never in writing. Some towns became known for particular styles. Abeokuta, for instance, was famous for Adir el-Ko, where patterns were drawn by hand with cassava paste using chicken feathers or metal combs. Oshogbo specialized in more geometric resist designs, while Ibadan's dyers favored deep uniform blues prized for their durability. The differences were subtle to the outsider, but instantly recognizable to those who lived within the dyeing world. These local styles became signatures, much like a painter's brushstroke. The markets also served as meeting points between the traditional Yoruba world and the broader currents of trade that linked West Africa together. Through itinerant traders and middlemen, Yoruba indigo cloths traveled northward toward the Hausa cities and even across the borders of present-day Benin and Togo. In return came salt, beads, and, eventually, imported fabrics that would later compete with local production. But for a long time, Yoruba indigo held its own not through novelty, but through endurance. There was something deeply local about indigo that made it resistant to change. Its making required local soil, local leaves, local ash. The vats themselves were alive with bacteria and microorganisms unique to their region. Moving a vat could kill it. This meant that true indigo could only be made where it was born. In this way, each courtyard was a microcosm of Yoruba ecology and spirituality. The land and craft were inseparable in Yoruba cosmology. Color carried meaning. White represented purity and the spiritual realm. Red evoked power and transformation. But blue, the color of indigo, was associated with calm, depth, and mystery. It was the color of Alakan, the goddess of the deep sea, whose wealth and wisdom were hidden beneath the waves. Many dyers saw their work as a quiet offering to her. Before opening a new vat, some would pour a small libation of water on the ground, whispering words of respect. They did not call it religion. It was simply what one did. The rhythm of dyeing followed the rhythm of the seasons. During the dry months, the heat helped ferment the vats quickly, though evaporation was constant and water had to be fetched more often. In the rainy season, when the air grew heavy and cool, fermentation slowed, and the dyers compensated by stirring longer and covering their vats more tightly with mats and leaves. There was always adjustment, never resistance. Nature set the tempo, and the women followed. For many of them, the dyeing courtyard was not merely a workplace, but a social world, a place where alliances were formed, disputes settled, and wisdom shared. Older women told stories of the past, how their mothers had dyed for colonial officers who ordered uniforms in Yoruba blue, how traders from Lagos once came with baskets of cowries and left with bundles of cloth, how a vat could be angry if left uncovered during a storm. These tales, part superstition and part memory, wove history into the rhythm of daily labor. Sometimes the dye pits were used as meeting places for young women of marriageable age. A suitor might visit the courtyard under the pretense of purchasing cloth, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman whose hands had created it. The indigo stains that marked her skin were considered a sign of diligence and good character. To marry an Alaro was to marry steadiness. But as the 19th century drew toward its end, winds of change began to stir. The British presence in Yoruba lands grew more visible, bringing not only foreign governance, but also new commodities. Among them were synthetic dyes from Europanelan blues and purples that required no fermentation, no ash, no waiting. They promised speed and uniformity. Traders quickly adopted them, drawn by their efficiency and lower cost. Yet many dyers mistrusted the new colors. They called them Aro Oyinbo, the white man's blue, and said it lacked soul. Still, the world was shifting. Market demand began to favor cheap, quick dyeing. Younger generations, lured by the promise of wage work or urban life, left the courtyards behind. Some vats went untended, their contents drying into cracked clay. The economy of blue, once the quiet backbone of village life, began to fade like old cloth left too long in the sun. And yet, even as this slow erosion unfolded, a strange thing happened. The value of traditional indigo, once so ordinary, began to rise. Traders and collectors from abroad sought out the deep Yoruba blues, marveling at their handmade irregularities, their organic hues. What had once been a daily craft became, slowly, an art form. The dyers, many of them elderly by then, watched with mild amusement as foreigners paid high prices for what their mothers had once sold for a few cowries. For them, the cloth was not a relic. It was a way of being. By the early 20th century, the markets had transformed. The hum of barter had softened, replaced by coin and paper, by British merchants with ledgers and scales. But even amid this new order, the Yoruba dyers held on to their blue. Not all vats survived, but some did, carefully tended in corners of courtyards, covered each night, stirred each morning. The women who remained saw themselves as keepers of a quiet lineage. Their hands moved slower now, but their rhythm was unchanged. The color beneath the sun had become the color. Beneath history, a stubborn reminder that not everything could be mechanized. Indigo resisted haste. It required a human touch, and in that requirement lay its dignity. Perhaps that is why, Even today, in the surviving dye pits of Abeokuta, the air still carries that familiar scent of fermentation. The pits may be fewer, the markets smaller, but the blue remains. It lingers in the fabric, in memory, and in the calm persistence of those who refuse to let it vanish. And as you imagine those courtyards, now half in ruin, half in revival, you might wonder what, truly, is the value of slowness in a world that has forgotten how to wait. By the middle of the 20th century, the indigo vats of southwestern Nigeria had become quieter. Many had been emptied, their clay linings cracked and flaking under the sun. Markets that once rang with the calls of cloth sellers now echoed with the chatter of traders selling imported fabric, printed in faraway factories with mechanical precision. Yet, in certain corners behind a courtyard wall, under a mango tree, or beside a slow stream, some of the old vats still breathed to a passerby. They might have looked like little more than relics, holes in the earth filled with dark liquid and leaves. But to the women who still tended them, they were living companions. A vat that had been kept alive for decades carried memory, a kind of character. It was said that the best vats were never allowed to die. When a master dyer grew too old to work, she might pass her vat to a younger relative with a small ceremony, a libation of palm wine, a whispered prayer, and the dipping of a single white cloth to mark the transfer of stewardship. The vat, like a family heirloom, was expected to outlive its keepers. These quiet inheritances kept the tradition breathing through generations of change. Even as towns grew crowded and factories multiplied, a few women continued to stir the old mixtures, their motions unchanged from those of their ancestors. Theirs was not an act of nostalgia, but of continuity. They did not speak of preserving culture, they were simply doing what they had always done. If you visit the town of Abeokuta today, you might find one such courtyard. Behind a weathered wooden gate, the air grows cool and damp. The ground is uneven with clay, stained in shades of blue and green. A few vats sit in neat rows, their rims darkened with use. A woman, perhaps in her 60s, stands with her arms plunged into one of them. She lifts a piece of fabric slowly, watching as it changes color in the air. Around her, chickens wander, pecking at stray leaves. The sound of the nearby road is muffled here, as if time itself has drawn a curtain. Her name might be unknown to most, something like Mama Adebayo or Iya Saad, but her work is a link in a long chain of hands. When she talks about dyeing, she does not speak of chemistry or technique. She speaks of patience, of knowing when the color feels right, of listening to the vat as one listens to a heartbeat. It tells you, she might say, when it is tired or hungry. You just have to listen. Such language blurs the line between craft and spirit, and indeed, in the Yoruba worldview, there was never much of a separation. Indigo was as spiritual as it was practical. The color blue was not merely aesthetic, it was protective. In Yoruba cosmology, Iro, the indigo dye, was said to carry calm energy, a balance between the visible and invisible worlds. It was linked to Alakon, the goddess of the deep sea, whose realm lay beneath the waves, filled with uncountable wealth and mystery. When dyers worked, they were, in a sense, invoking her silent collaboration between woman, earth, and divinity. Many dyeing courtyards once kept a small altar to Olakon, often a simple pot filled with water and shells. Offerings of white chalk or cowries might be placed there before beginning a new vat. These gestures were not about worship in the Western sense, but about harmony. To dye cloth successfully, one had to be in balance with oneself, with the community, and with the unseen forces of the world. The dye would not take if the heart was restless or angry, elders said. A good dyer needed calm hands and a peaceful mind. In this way, the dyeing process became a form of meditation. The slow rhythm of dipping, wringing, and airing the cloth mirrored the rhythm of breath. The repetition, far from dulling the senses, invited stillness. Some women said they solved their problems while stirring the vat. Others said they forgot them entirely. The courtyard was both workplace and sanctuary, a place where time softened as the years went on. A small revival began to stir. In the 1970s and 1980s, artists and historians started to take interest in the old crafts that had nearly vanished under colonial and industrial pressures. Among these was the Adir tradition, the indigo resist dyeing technique unique to the Yoruba. Art schools in Nigeria began to document the patterns and processes, and exhibitions abroad celebrated their quiet complexity. Western visitors marveled at the fact that such sophisticated designs were made without rulers or machines, using only feathers, sticks, and steady hands. For the older dyers, this attention was both strange and amusing. What outsiders called heritage art was, to them, simply work. They had never thought of their designs as modern or ancient, only as ours. Yet the renewed interest brought small benefits. Some received commissions, others taught workshops. Younger women, seeing that there was again value in the blue cloth, began to learn once more. The vats that had nearly gone silent began to bubble again. Still, change had left its marks. Many of the new dyers used a mix of traditional and synthetic materials. Some replaced wood ash with soda, or used metal drums instead of clay pits. The colors were faster, the processes cleaner, but something intangible, something slow and breathing, was often missing. The elders noticed, though they rarely said so aloud. They would smile, nod, and let the younger generation find its own rhythm in recent years. However, there has been another kind of revival, one not driven by commerce, but by curiosity. Artists, designers, and historians from both Nigeria and abroad have returned to the villages to learn from the remaining masters. They study not only the technique, but the philosophy of indigo, the idea that beauty comes from slowness, that imperfection is part of truth, that color can carry memory. In their hands, Yoruba indigo has found new life, not as museum artifact, but as living dialogue between past and present. One of the most enduring aspects of this craft is the way it binds generations. Even today, when a young woman learns to stir a vat, she is repeating gestures her ancestors made hundreds of years ago. When she dips a cloth and watches it change color in the air, she is witnessing the same small miracle that her great-grandmother once saw. The blue on her hands is the same blue that stained the hands of women who lived and died before her. There is continuity in that, a quiet, unbroken thread running through time. And yet, every generation adds its own shade to the dye. Modern dyers experiment with new motifs, combining a dyer with batik or digital printing, creating hybrid forms that carry old souls in new skins. Some see this as loss, others as evolution. But perhaps it is simply what indigo has always done: absorb, transform, and endure. If you were to trace a single indigo cloth from leaf to loom to market to museum, you would find within it a record of countless small acts: hands grinding leaves, stirring vats, folding cloth, negotiating prices, teaching daughters. None of these acts alone seem grand. They are domestic, repetitive, quiet, and yet together they have shaped economies, aesthetics, and histories. The great monuments of Yoruba civilization, its sculptures, its architecture, its music may dazzle with grandeur. But the indigo cloth whispers a different kind of story, one of persistence, humility, and care. To fall asleep imagining the life of an indigo dyer is to fall into a rhythm older than words. You can almost hear it: the soft slosh of fabric in the vat, the creak of a stool, the hum of a woman's voice as she works. You can feel the heat of the sun on clay walls, the coolness of water on blue-stained hands. The courtyard is simple, but it contains everything: earth, air, water, color, patience. And when the day ends, when the last cloth is hung and the courtyard grows quiet, the blue deepens in the dimming light. It is a blue that holds both history and forgetting, both labor and rest. It is the color of dusk, of continuity, of the space between waking and sleep. In the end, the story of Yoruba indigo is not a tale of decline or revival, but of endurance. The vats may rise and fall, the markets may change, but the knowledge, the rhythm of stirring and waiting, it lives in the hands that remember, in the air that smells faintly of fermentation, in the calm persistence of those who still find beauty in repetition. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the indigo workshops, that meaning does not always shout. Sometimes it hums softly in the shade of a courtyard, in the patience of a woman stirring color into being. The blue endures because the hands endure, and the hands endure because somewhere, deep within the clay of the earth and the rhythm of breath, there is still the will to make something beautiful. Slowly so, when you see a piece of indigo cloth, whether in a museum, a market, or folded neatly in a trunk, remember that it was once alive. Remember the vats that never slept, the women who stirred them, and the color that refused to fade. The indigo, as ever, still breathes beneath the sun. The story of indigo in Yoruba land does not begin with cloth or commerce. It begins with a plant, a small, unremarkable shrub that grew quietly in the heat, its narrow leaves green, its stems wiry and thin. It was called ilu by the Yoruba, and in that word lay centuries of unspoken partnership between humans and the land. Long before dyeing became a craft, before it was a profession or a source of pride, the people who lived on the red earth of the Southwest already understood that color could be coaxed from nature if one only had the patience to wait. The earliest Yoruba communities lived with a deep awareness of their environment. Every plant had a use, every season a rhythm. The ilu plant was first known not for its color, but for its medicinal qualities. Elders boiled its leaves in water to make a bitter tonic said to cool fevers and cleanse the blood. Farmers used it to treat the soil after heavy rains, believing it restored balance to the ground. It was a modest plant, one among many that filled the edges of farms and footpaths. No one can say exactly when someone first noticed that, when crushed, the leaves stained their hands. Perhaps it was an accident, a child playing with the pulp, or a woman washing a basket of leaves in a clay bowl. Perhaps it was deliberate experimentation, one of the countless small discoveries that mark the daily life of human curiosity. Whatever the moment, the stain did not fade. It darkened as it dried, and from that simple observation grew an art form that would shape villages for centuries. To transform leaf into lasting color required more than curiosity. It required a system, a process refined through endless trial and error. Over time, people learned that the dye was not in the leaf itself, but in what the leaf became after it had died and fermented. The green had to give way to blue through decay. It was a slow revelation, as though the land itself were teaching its people patience. The making of the dye became a ritual long before it was a trade. In early Yoruba villages, the preparation of indigo was often accompanied by quiet ceremony. The first leaves of the season were gathered not by anyone, but by women of calm disposition, those believed to possess iwa-peel, gentle character. They would pick the leaves early in the morning, before the sun grew strong, and avoid speaking loudly during the task. It was said that too much noise would startle the spirit of the plant, making it yield weak color. The leaves were carried home in woven baskets and laid out to wilt slightly in the shade. Then they were pounded in mortar with ash and water, sometimes mixed with the residue of an old vat to teach the new one how to live. This idea that a vat must learn from its ancestor was at the heart of Yoruba Indigo philosophy. Each new batch carried the memory of the last, linking generations of dyeing in an unbroken chain. Fermentation took place in clay pots or pits dug directly into the earth. These were lined with banana leaves to prevent the mixture from leaking. As the days passed, the surface of the liquid changed from dull green to iridescent blue-green, with tiny bubbles forming like breath on the water. The dyers watched closely, using sight, smell, and even sound to judge its readiness. When the vat sighed faintly or gave off a sweet, earthy odor, they knew it was alive in the beginning. Indigo was not made for sale. It was made for ceremony. Certain cloths were reserved for rituals, births, marriages, funerals, and harvest celebrations. Color marked occasion. A newly married woman might receive a deep blue wrapper as part of her dowry, symbolizing calm and stability in her new home. A newborn might be swaddled in a lighter shade to invite peace and health. Even in death, blue was worn to accompany the departed across the boundary between worlds, for it was believed to be a color that soothed the spirit. The process of dyeing itself was treated with quiet reverence. Before opening a new vat, the leading dyer, often an elder woman, would pour a libation of water on the ground, murmuring a short prayer. "May the color stay deep," she might say. "May the cloth take it well." The words were not dramatic, only habitual, like the way a craftsman might whisper to his tools before beginning work. In Yoruba tradition, work and prayer were not separate things. To do something with focus was already a form of devotion. As the practice grew more widespread, certain families became known for their skill. In each town, you could name the compounds where the best dyers lived, where blue stains marked the thresholds like quiet signatures. Girls born into these families learned the art as naturally as they learned to walk. By the time they were 10 or 12, their hands already carried faint traces of indigo. and their mothers began to teach them the rhythm of stirring, the order of dipping, the patience of waiting. The rhythm of the vats often shaped the rhythm of the household. Meals were timed around stirring cycles. Conversations flowed in pauses between dye dips. Even music adjusted to the slow pulse of the craft. Some say that the gentle beat of the Yoruba gangan drum, their talking drum mirrors the sound of stirring dye, a steady, meditative pattern that rises and falls like breath. Whether that is true or not, the connection feels right. In Yoruba thought, work, art, and spirit often echo one another. Indigo also began to intertwine with other crafts. The weavers who produced narrow strips of cotton cloths called asa on the dyers for color. The relationship between weaver and dyer was symbiotic. The weaver created the structure. The dyer gave it life. A good weaver might spend weeks producing fine, even threads. A skilled dyer could ruin it in an hour if her vat was unbalanced. Trust was essential. In some towns, families of weavers and dyers arranged marriages between their children to keep the craft circle intact. By the 18th century, Yoruba Indigo had developed into an intricate social system. The dyeing courtyards were no longer just places of work. They were gathering grounds for knowledge, gossip, and community decision-making. Women discussed market news and arranged apprenticeships. They exchanged recipes for ash mixtures and shared advice on household matters. Young girls who joined the work learned not only about dyeing, but about discipline, cooperation, and womanhood. To learn indigo was to learn life. What made the practice so enduring was its adaptability. The indigo pits could thrive in large towns or small villages in times of prosperity or hardship. When crops failed, dyeing could still continue as long as there was water and ash. When conflict disrupted trade, people turned inward, relying on local materials. Indigo thus became both an art and a strategy for survival, a steady thread through unstable times. It also became a language of identity. Different towns developed their own shades and patterns, subtle variations in hue that told you where a cloth had been made. Abayokuta blues tended toward the dark and smoky. Oshogbos were luminous and bright. A practiced eye could look at a cloth and know its origin instantly, the way one might recognize a dialect. The dyes themselves carried the accents of the earth, the minerals in the water, the composition of the ash, the temperature of the sun. Each vat, each village, spoke its own shade beyond their practical use. The indigo workshops became spaces of quiet power for women. In a society where men often dominated public leadership, the dyeing courtyards offered an alternative authority, one rooted in skill, cooperation, and endurance. The Isha Alaro, or master dyer, commanded respect not through speech but through steadiness. Her knowledge was inherited, her influence subtle but profound. She could bless a cloth with her reputation alone. In disputes, her word carried weight. To offend her was to risk more than social disapproval. It was to anger the spirit of the dye itself. And so, through the simple act of making color, Yoruba women built a network of quiet authority that extended from the courtyard to the marketplace, from the household to the ritual sphere. They were custodians of both beauty and stability. Their hands held the memory of the community. Their vats reflected its balance. In this sense, indigo was not only a craft, but a mirror living. symbol of harmony between human effort and the natural world. Yet the beauty of it all was that it remained ordinary. There were no grand ceremonies, no temples, no official priests, only the daily rhythm of gathering, stirring, and waiting. Only the slow, breathing continuity of work done well. If you stood by one of those vats at dusk, when the women finished their labor and the air smelled of clay and ferment, you might see the last rays of sunlight glint off the indigo's surface, turning it momentarily into liquid sky. The courtyard would be quiet, except for the sound of insects and the faint rustle of cloth. The women would cover their vats with mats, close their gates, and walk home, their feet bare against the earth. The blue stains on their hands would catch the fading light, small flashes of color in the gathering dark. That was where the color began, not in the plant, not in the market, but in the calm repetition of hands that moved in harmony with the world around them. Color, for the Yoruba dyer, was not made, it was invited. And perhaps that is why the blue never truly faded. By the time the morning sun reached the courtyards, the indigo vats were already breathing. Faint rings of vapor rose from the surface, carrying the sweet-sour scent of fermentation. Around them, the dying women gathered, tying their wrappers high above their knees, rolling their sleeves, and greeting each other softly. The air was filled not with haste, but with rhythm, the slow, deliberate rhythm of work done in time with the heart. Each courtyard had its own sound. Some were marked by quiet conversation, others by song. The Yoruba Dyers had songs for every stage of the process, songs to wake the vats, to summon patience, to steady the hands of apprentices. These were not songs of worship in the formal sense. They were work songs, stitched together from fragments of proverb, praise, and instruction. A woman might hum as she stirred the vat, "Indigo, my friend, stay calm today. Do not rise too quickly. Do not sleep too long." The words were simple, but they reflected a belief that the dye had a spirit, temperamental, responsive, alive. The vats were spoken to as one might speak to a child or a guest, with care and familiarity. When a vat turned, meaning its fermentation failed, the dyers would say it had fallen ill. Remedies were administered, a little more ash, a handful of old dye, a whisper of encouragement. And when the vat recovered, when it breathed again, the women would laugh with relief, as though a friend had returned from sickness. In Yoruba understanding, this way of treating the dye was not superstition, it was philosophy. Everything in the world possessed ace, the vital force of existence. To act carelessly toward a thing was to disturb its ace. To act gently was to align with it. Thus, the calm and patience of the dyers were not just practical virtues, but spiritual ones. A woman who grew angry while stirring might spoil the batch, not because of chemistry, but because emotion itself could upset the balance of forces within the vat. It was this blending of the physical and the metaphysical that made the indigo craft so enduring. In the quiet courtyards of Abeokuta, Oshogbo, and Isian, dyeing was both a labor and a lesson. Young apprentices learned not only the steps of the process, but the values behind them: composure, respect, and attentiveness. To be a good dyer, one had to be a good person, or at least strive to be. Elder women, known as Iya Alaro, were not simply masters of technique. They were moral guides, mediators of disputes, and keepers of community history. The courtyard was their domain, but its influence extended far beyond its walls. People came to them for advice on matters that had nothing to do with cloth marriage, illness, family quarrels. Their wisdom was trusted because it was earned through work that required steadiness and balance. In a way, the vats themselves became teachers, silent examples of how to hold contradictions together, decay and creation, patience and movement, individuality and cooperation. The dyes also became a record of continuity. Each vat was inherited, maintained, and named. Some vats lasted for decades, their microbial culture passed down like an heirloom. There were vats called Oyu, Olakon, the eyes of the sea, and Oshogbo, the old mother. These names gave the vats personality and dignity, reinforcing the sense that dyeing was a living lineage. When a master dyer died, her vat might be left untouched for 40 days in mourning, covered carefully and fed small offerings of water. Only after ritual prayers would her apprentice reopen it, whispering a greeting to the spirit of her teacher before stirring. These customs might seem symbolic, but they served practical ends. By treating the vat as sacred, the dyers ensured discipline. No one dared neglect the mixture, spill ash carelessly, or leave the courtyard in disarray. Reverence became a form of quality control, and in the stillness of that structure, beauty emerged. The dyeing courtyards were rarely places of isolation. They pulsed with communal life. Children ran errands between workshops. Market women stopped by to check on commissions. Travelers brought stories from other towns. The indigo pits, always simmering, became centers of exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas. One might learn about distant markets in Oyo or Ibadan while waiting for a cloth to take its third dip. The flow of blue connected not only fibers but people over time. The courtyard routines formed a pattern as reliable as the rising of the sun. Early mornings were for preparation, fetching water from the well, measuring ash, checking the vats. Midday was for dipping, when the light was strongest and the cloth could be observed clearly. The dyers worked in teams, each woman knowing her role, one to soak, one to wring, one to hang the cloth on wooden poles to dry. Between tasks, they rested in the shade, rubbing their hands with oil to keep the dye from cracking their skin. Their laughter was soft, their talk unhurried. Even the motion of wringing cloth was done with measured grace, as though speed might offend the blue. When visitors asked why the women moved so slowly, they replied with a proverb: "The river that rushes makes noise. The one that knows its path flows quietly." It was not that the work was easy, it was demanding, physically and mentally, but it was never frantic. The calm itself was part of the process. Indigo demanded time. A deep, even color could only be achieved through repeated dips and long drying periods. Rushing meant uneven shade or patchy results. In a world that prized balance, haste was considered not just a technical flaw, but a moral one. The finished cloths, once dyed and dried, were rinsed in running water, often at a communal stream. This final washing was as much social as it was practical. Women met at the riverbanks, chatting as they worked, their laughter mixing with the sound of water and cloth. Some sang short refrains: "Blue that does not fade, stay with me. May my work carry peace to every household." The act of washing became a kind of informal blessing on the garments. When the women returned to their courtyards, the cloths gleamed in the sun, a deep celestial blue, folded neatly and stacked in baskets. They looked like pieces of captured sky. It was around this stage that trade entered the story. Market days in Yoruba towns were vast, rhythmic affairs, following a 4-day cycle linked to the traditional calendar. Indigo dyers carried their folded cloths to the market square at dawn, spreading them out on mats or hanging them from poles. Buyers examined the shades carefully, running fingers over the texture, commenting softly. A deep, even blue was prized. Streaks or blotches reduced value. But beyond quality, there was prestige in owning cloth from certain workshops. The signature of a well-known Ija Alaro could elevate a wrapper from ordinary to ceremonial. As demand grew, so did complexity. Some dyers began to specialize in pattern dyeing, folding, or stitching the cloth before dyeing to create designs known collectively as adir. Circles, spirals, and dotted grids appeared, each with symbolic meaning. These patterns turned simple blue wrappers into stories of lineage, of aspiration, of daily life. One popular design, Olakon, represented the goddess of the deep ocean, whose wealth and mystery mirrored the indigo vat itself. Another Ibadan is sweet, celebrated local pride. Through these patterns, indigo became both personal and communal language. Each motif a quiet statement of belonging. Even the seemingly dull aspects of the trade pricing, bartering, carrying goods had their own steady dignity. The dyeing women were disciplined record keepers, maintaining mental accounts of who owed what, which vat produced which hue, and how much ash was used per batch. They could estimate, by sight alone, how long a cloth had been dipped. This precision was rarely celebrated, but it was the foundation upon which the entire economy of indigo rested. Travelers who visited Yoruba towns in the 19th century often remarked on the orderliness of the dyeing quarters. British explorers noted women at their vats, patient as monks, and described the color as deeper than any imported from the Indies. Few understood the philosophy behind it. They saw only commerce. But within those calm courtyards, a quiet form of resistance thrived, resistance through preservation, through the refusal to rush or forget, because, by that time, the world beyond the dye pits had begun to change. European trade had brought new goods, new fabrics, and with them the slow erosion of local crafts. But in the blue vats of Yoruba land, the old rhythm continued. The women stirred, dipped, and sang as they always had. The world outside might shift, but indigo was loyal to patience, to the untrained eye. All this might seem ordinary, too slow, too repetitive, even boring, but to the people within it, each motion carried meaning. The sound of the sticks stirring the vat was the sound of continuity. The smell of the dye was the scent of home. And the faint stain left on the fingers was not a blemish, but a baja sign that one belonged to something older and steadier than time. At dusk, as the day cooled and the last cloths hung to dry, the women often gathered for brief rest. Some would chew kola nut, others would doze lightly, heads resting on their folded arms. Children played nearby, tracing shapes in the dust. The vats, covered with mats, seemed to sigh in contentment. It was said that if you listened closely at that hour, you could hear the vats murmuring, softly breathing, waiting, dreaming of the next day's work. And in those fading moments of daylight, one might sense what made indigo more than a craft. It was a meditation on slowness, an affirmation that even the smallest, most repetitive acts could hold the weight of culture and time. But soon, the calm of the dye pits would face its greatest test. The cloth that once defined local identity began to travel beyond Yoruba markets to coastal ports, to ships, and eventually across oceans. Foreign merchants admired the depth of its color and the steadiness of its production. The blue that began in small earthen vats was about to enter the wider world of trade and empire. And with that, the peaceful rhythm of the Yoruba dyers would meet the restless current of global commerce. The indigo vats of Yoruba villages had long been spaces of quiet discipline, rhythm, and ritual. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, however, their blue began to travel far beyond the courtyards, streams, and small markets of Abeokuta, Oshogbo, and Isian. Trade networks expanded inland and to coastal ports, linking local dyeing practices with the growing currents of global commerce. Where once indigo had been a medium of quiet meditation, it now became a commodity valued not only for its hue, but for its durability, its pattern, and, increasingly, its market price. European merchants, initially Portuguese, then British, French, and Dutch, had long admired West African cloth. By the early 19th century, Yoruba indigo cloths were known across the Niger Delta and along the Benin coast. Traders paid in cowrie shells, textiles, or imported goods such as salt, beads, or iron implements. Some Yoruba dyers, once solely focused on ritual and local use, found themselves negotiating terms for bundles of cloth with merchants who spoke in unfamiliar tongues. The slow, measured rhythm of the courtyard now intersected with the bustling, sometimes harsh pace of international trade. This expansion brought both opportunity and tension. The Yoruba dyers were deeply skilled, but the European demand introduced pressures foreign to the traditional economy. Some merchants insisted on uniform lengths and consistent color. They had little patience for the natural irregularities of a vat, the subtle tonal shifts that gave each cloth its character. As a result, the women had to learn subtle adaptations, slightly faster fermentation, careful selection of leaves, more meticulous timing without sacrificing the integrity of the dye. Meanwhile, imitation dyes began to appear. Imported synthetic blue aniline dyes manufactured in Europe offered speed and predictability. Traders occasionally pressed villagers to adopt these, promising higher returns and easier labor. Yet many Yoruba dyers resisted. Synthetic color lacked depth and life. It did not breathe like a well-tended vat, nor did it respond to the rhythm of human hands. In this resistance lay the quiet assertion of expertise and identity. Indigo, for the Yoruba, was not just blue. It was patience, lineage, and connection to the earth. Within the villages, the impact of this global interaction was profound. Some young women were drawn to coastal towns, enticed by opportunities to sell cloth or work with foreign merchants. Others remained, preserving traditional methods with quiet determination. The older Dyersaya Alaro passed down vats carefully, along with the philosophy of patience, moral discipline, and attentiveness to the spirit of the dye. They emphasized that the quality of indigo was inseparable from the care of hands and mind. A vat was like a living teacher. It could not be rushed, it could not be coerced, and it remembered every hand that stirred it. Despite these pressures, the ceremonial and ritual dimensions of dyeing remained intact. Cloths were still used in marriage, birth, and funerary ceremonies. Community members still gathered to observe or assist during important batches. Songs and work rhythms continued to structure the day. In effect, the Yoruba maintained a dual existence, a participation in global trade, alongside the cultivation of intimate local traditions. This balance allowed indigo dyeing to survive when other crafts had been diminished or entirely replaced. Over time, the export of indigo cloth brought international recognition to Yoruba dyeing techniques. Anthropologists and collectors documented patterns, praising the intricacy of a dyer designs and the depth of color achieved without machinery. Yet even as indigo became a recognized art form abroad, within the villages it remained, first and foremost, a living practice. It was tied to family, to ritual, to patience, and to moral cultivation. The recognition was secondary to the labor, the care, and the rhythm of the courtyard. The story of Yoruba Indigo also demonstrates resilience in the face of technological change. Synthetic dyes eventually became widespread, and mechanized textile production grew across West Africa. Many vats were abandoned, and markets shifted to mass-produced goods. Yet pockets of traditional dyers persisted. They adjusted, teaching new generations to blend old techniques with new realities, preserving the essence of their craft even in a modernizing world. In this way, the Yoruba Indigo tradition became a living archive of human skill, endurance, and philosophy, quiet counterpoint to the speed and uniformity of industrial production. Even today, the blue remains. Visiting the villages, one can see vats carefully maintained by women who learned from their mothers and grandmothers. The air carries the familiar scent of fermentation. The rhythm of dipping, wringing, and hanging cloth continues as it did centuries ago. Children run errands between vats. Apprentices absorb the slow lessons of patience, and songs fill the courtyard with the steady pulse of life. This continuity, despite centuries of economic, social, and technological change, is remarkable. In Yoruba cosmology, the color blue retains symbolic power. It represents calm, depth, and spiritual protection, a link to Olokun, the goddess of the sea, whose wisdom is hidden beneath the waves. The dyeing process, in essence, is a ritual of alignment with nature, with community, and with the invisible forces of the world. Every careful stir, every whispered blessing, every patient pause embodies these values. The vats are not merely chemical reactions. They are instruments of continuity, resilience, and moral cultivation. The export of indigo also carried Yoruba culture beyond its borders. Traders brought cloths to other regions, where the patterns and shades became known and appreciated. Though the context changed, each cloth carried with it echoes of the villages, the rhythm of the courtyards, the patience of hands, the songs beneath the vats. In this sense, the Yoruba workshops were quietly shaping aesthetic and economic history across West Africa and even abroad, one careful dip at a time. Yet, despite global recognition and market adaptation, the essence of the craft has remained local and personal. Each vat still requires careful tending. Every pattern still reflects human choice. and the rhythm of the courtyard remains the measure of quality. The indigo survives because it is embedded in a web of social, ecological, and spiritual relationships. Its longevity is less about commerce than about community, continuity, and a deliberate engagement with slowness. In reflecting on this, one might wonder how many other traditions, subtle, disciplined, and slow, exist unnoticed, quietly shaping culture and sustaining communities. Yoruba Indigo is a vivid example of what can endure when human effort aligns with patience, care, and respect for the world. The color persists not only on cloth but in memory, practice, and imagination. And so, when you see the deep blue of Yoruba Indigo today, whether in a market, a museum, or a village courtyard, you are witnessing the culmination of centuries of meticulous work, moral discipline, and spiritual alignment. Each piece is a testament to calm persistence in a world that often values speed over care. It is a reminder that even the simplest materials, treated with patience and attention, can carry meaning across generations, borders, and time. Perhaps the quietest lesson of all is this: the blue endures because the rhythm endures. The hands that stir, the vats that breathe, the songs that rise in soft cadence, they persist not through force or attention, but through consistency, humility, and care. In that endurance lies a history of patience, resilience, and understated brilliance, a history that is, in many ways, still being written. The calm of the dye pits continues, whispering its lessons beneath the sun. Beneath the hands of women who remember, beneath the folds of cloth dyed with deep, living blue. It reminds us that not all stories of history are loud, fast, or dramatic. Some are patient, measured, and serene, and in their quiet rhythm, they endure far longer than we might ever expect. In the heart of the old Benin kingdom, where narrow streets wound between clay walls and courtyards, the air carries a particular quiet. It is not a silence devoid of life. Rather, it is a silence shaped by attention. The murmur of children playing, the occasional clatter of a metal pot, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze form a gentle backdrop to work that has remained remarkably consistent for centuries. Here, in that quiet wood, is transformed. Edo carvers have worked with wood for generations, producing everything from ceremonial objects to utilitarian items for daily life. Their craft is not rapid, it is deliberate, guided by patience, repetition, and respect for the material. A single wooden figure, perhaps representing a revered ancestor or a member of the royal court, may take months, even years, from the first cut of the axe to the final polishing of its surface. In these streets, speed is subordinate to accuracy, subtlety, and fidelity to tradition. Wood in Benin is not just material, it is alive in memory, lineage, and spirit. Ebony and Iroko, mahogany and African oak each carries distinct textures and densities. Each requires careful handling. The Edo carvers do not force the wood, they observe it. Knots, grain, and natural curves guide the process. A hurried stroke can split the material irreparably. In this way, the carver enters into a dialogue with the tree, listening for what the wood will allow and respecting what it resists. The apprenticeship begins early, often before adolescence. Boys and girls, though predominantly boys in traditional practice, learn to recognize the different species of trees, the seasons for cutting, and the slow preparation required before carving begins. Trees are felled not in haste but in a controlled, often ceremonial manner. Offerings of kola nut, palm wine, or libations may accompany the first cut, a gesture acknowledging the life taken for the creation of art. The respect for the living tree translates into patience at the bench. A carver who disregards the spirit of the wood risks both material and moral failure. The streets of Benin itself serve as informal classrooms. Carving workshops are simple. Open courtyards or shaded verandas with tools neatly arrayed on mats or low wooden tables. Adzes, chisels, knives, and rasps, each sharpened meticulously, rest within reach. The air is filled with the subtle fragrance of fresh-cut timber, mingling with smoke from cooking fires and the occasional scent of palm oil or fermented grains. The rhythm of work is steady. Cut, scrape, file, polish. Each motion is repeated countless times, shaping not only the wood but the hands that guide it. Carvers work on a wide variety of objects. Some pieces are functional: stools, doors, masks, and household implements. Others are ceremonial, designed for palace rituals or community festivals. Bronze plaques, while famous in Benin art, often accompany wooden carvings, and together they form a coherent visual and spiritual language. Figures may represent ancestors, deities, or royalty, but they are always rendered with attention to proportion, balance, and harmony. Even seemingly minor details, like the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head, or the angle of a hand, carry significance. The ordinary is never overlooked. The process is slow by necessity. Ebony, dense and resistant, demands repeated filing and scraping. A carver must gauge pressure carefully, feeling the subtle give of the wood. A single mistake can ruin weeks of work. The labor is physically demanding, yet meditative. Hands, arms, and back ache, but the rhythm of repetition produces a kind of calm focus. Experienced carvers often describe the sensation of listening to the wood, as if it were speaking in grain patterns and resistance. The wood itself dictates pace, and the master learns to obey. In addition to technical skill, Edo carvers inherit knowledge from community and lineage. Oral traditions convey the meanings of motifs, the symbolic relationships between figures, and the stories behind particular shapes. Carvers learn to distinguish styles associated with specific families or royal workshops. A subtle change in facial features or posture signals both identity and intention. In this way, carving is not only craft, but a living archive of history, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost in the absence of written records. Even the smallest objects carry layered meanings. A spoon carved from a particular tree may honor a deceased relative. A stool might signal rank within the household or community. Masks worn during ceremonies serve as conduits to ancestors or deities. Each item is embedded with purpose, yet its creation relies on calm repetition and attentiveness. The spiritual dimension of carving requires that the maker's mind be steady. Distraction or impatience can ruin not just the piece, but its metaphysical efficacy. The streets themselves influence the work. Benin's narrow alleys, lined with clay walls and the occasional shade tree, encourage a pace that mirrors the life within the workshops. Passersby offer greetings, neighbors exchange news, and children play nearby. Noise is moderated by the natural contours of the town. Sound carries but does not overwhelm. This environment allows carvers to maintain prolonged focus without complete isolation, blending private labor with communal observation. At times, carvers gather to collaborate on larger projects. A ceremonial door or palace figure may require multiple artisans, each specializing in particular cuts, detailing, or finishing. Coordination demands patience and careful attention. The work proceeds in stages: rough shaping, fine carving, detailing, polishing. Each stage slows the rhythm, emphasizing deliberation over speed. Apprentices observe, sometimes for months, before contributing directly. Observation is considered as essential as action. Learning the cadence, timing, and philosophy of carving is part of mastering the craft. Wood, like indigo, carries both visible and invisible lessons. The grain may inform technique, but the age of the tree, the direction of growth, and even prior exposure to sun and wind affect the final product. A skilled carver senses these subtleties and adapts accordingly. Mistakes are corrected with patience rather than force. A split can be bridged with inlays or adjustments. A surface blemish may be incorporated into design. Flexibility, as much as precision, is essential. The pace of work encourages reflection. Carvers often describe entering a mental space where time dilates, minutes stretch, hours blur. The repetitive motions allow the mind to settle, free from external distraction. In this way, carving becomes a form of meditation. The physical rhythm supports mental calm. Each pass of the chisel, each filing of a surface, reinforces attention, discipline, and connection to both material and community. The apprenticeship also includes instruction in cultural context. Carvers are taught the stories behind motifs, the lineage of kings and chiefs, the mythology of the Edo people. This knowledge ensures that art is not only technically proficient, but historically and socially meaningful. An ancestor figure is not merely a carved form. It embodies continuity, respect, and moral instruction. The act of carving preserves history in a way that written records cannot replicate. Daily life in the carving workshops remains ordinary in outward appearance, but extraordinary in cumulative effect. Repetition, patience, and meticulous care shape both the object and the artisan. Hands acquire memory, eyes train to notice subtle imperfections, and minds internalize rhythm. Over months or years, an apprentice evolves into a master, capable of producing works of beauty and significance. Each creation is thus a product of skill, heritage, and enduring attention. By dusk, the streets of Benin grow quiet again. Shadows lengthen across courtyards, blending with the scent of sawdust and smoke from cooking fires. Tools are cleaned, workshops tidied, and unfinished pieces covered to await the next day. The town exhales a slow, steady breath, carrying with it the residue of calm labor. In the quiet, one can almost sense the patience embedded in the wood itself, record of the hands that shaped it, the lineage that guided them, and the streets that held them steady. Despite this continuity, questions linger. How does such a measured, patient craft endure when outside forces, colonial intrusion, new materials, trade demands begin to shift the rhythm of life? How does the slow persistence of the Edo carver survive in a world increasingly enamored with speed and spectacle? These are the questions that hover as night falls over the Benin kingdom, settling softly among the alleys and courtyards where the next day's chisels will once again awaken the patience of the wood. The streets of Benin are quiet, but the workshops pulse with a different kind of life. Within the clay-walled courtyards, wood is transformed not just into objects, but into carriers of social, spiritual, and historical meaning. Every stroke of the adze or knife, every scrape of the rasp, is guided by inherited knowledge. For Edo carvers, the act of shaping timber is inseparable from the rituals, rhythms, and rules of the community. Before a block of wood is touched, it is treated with care. The selection of the tree itself is both practical and ceremonial. Ebony, iroko, and mahogany are favored, but it is not just density or color that matters. Carvers consider the life of the tree, its exposure to sun and wind, the curves of its trunk, even the direction of its grain. These factors are understood as imprints of the tree's spirit and history. Cutting a tree is not merely taking wood, is entering into a contract with a living being. Traditionally, the first cut is accompanied by offerings, kola nut, palm wine, or small libations poured onto the soil. These gestures, repeated across centuries, remind the carvers that respect is foundational to both material and moral success. The apprentices learn early that carving is slow, deliberate work. The rhythm of the courtyard is dictated by the wood itself. A dense block of ebony may require days to reduce to rough shape. Softer iroko allows quicker progress, but demands precision to avoid splintering. Carvers speak of listening to the grain, a phrase that denotes more than technique. It implies mindfulness. The chisel is an extension of perception, each cut responding to the unique resistance and narrative embedded in the wood socially. The workshops are sites of subtle hierarchy and communal interaction. Master carvers, often referred to as iya adder for female masters, or oba adder for male counterparts, command respect through demonstrated skill and lineage knowledge. Their apprentices, sometimes living within the workshop compound, observe for months before handling tools. Observation is part of training. Hands must learn the rhythm and timing of cuts, but the mind must first understand the patterns, proportions, and motifs. Here, patience is more than virtue, it is curriculum. Motifs and designs are deeply codified. A carved ancestral figure may have elongated earlobes, specific facial markings, or particular postures that identify it with a lineage, status, or spiritual role. Masks incorporate geometric patterns that communicate messages to participants during ceremonies. Even seemingly decorative elements are loaded with symbolic meaning. Every pattern, line, and angle carries instruction about family, community, spirituality, and morality. These design choices are remembered orally and visually, passing from master to apprentice across generations. Rituals extend to the workspace itself. Courtyards are maintained with care, swept clean, tools arranged neatly, and work-in-progress pieces covered when not attended. Some workshops include small altars or sacred spaces where offerings are made to ancestors, deities, or the spirits of the trees themselves. Before beginning a piece, destined for a royal palace or significant ceremony. The master may recite blessings or prayers, invoking guidance, protection, and precision. This practice reinforces the belief that the object, the hands that make it, and the community that will use it are interconnected. Carving becomes a mediation between material, human, and spiritual realms. Ceremonial wood, such as palace doors, thrones, or figures, carries additional layers of ritual responsibility. These objects often take years to complete, involving multiple carvers, each responsible for specific elements. Coordination demands not only technical skill, but social discipline, respect for hierarchy, careful communication, and observance of rhythm. Timing, sequence, and attention to detail are critical. A misaligned design or rushed cut could compromise the symbolic integrity of the piece. The process also integrates apprentices into broader cultural knowledge. Beyond tools and techniques, they learn oral histories, genealogies, and myths. A figure of a king is not a generic representation. It embodies stories of reign, victories, and lineage. The apprentice learns how postures, gestures, and proportion convey authority or moral instruction. Even mundane objects, carved stool or spoon, carry embedded lessons about order, respect, and proper conduct. Carving becomes an educational platform as much as a craft. In addition to formal apprenticeship, collaboration is central to Edo carving culture. Larger projects require coordinated efforts between multiple artisans. Each contributes according to skill. One may rough out the figure, another refines features, a third adds intricate detailing. The rhythm of work becomes a choreography of patience, requiring attentiveness to both the wood and each other. Communication is minimal but precise. Gestures, eye contact, and subtle sounds maintain coordination. This quiet collaboration mirrors the ethos of the individual craft, deliberate, respectful, and steady. The spiritual dimension is inseparable from practical concerns. Carvers believe that objects intended for rituals, ancestors, or royalty hold a life force. A figure not made with care risks failing in its ceremonial role. A throne must convey authority, not only in form, but in moral presence. A mask must guide participants spiritually during festivals. Therefore, focus and mindfulness are not optional, they are essential. The hand that wavers, the thought that drifts, can disrupt the intended effect. In this way, the craft enforces moral discipline as much as technical precision. Apprenticeship also involves learning about patience through time-intensive tasks. Polishing, sanding, and refining surfaces may take days for a single element. Attention to minute detail is enforced. Nothing is skipped or rushed. Through repetition, apprentices internalize rhythm, spatial reasoning, and tactile sensitivity. Over years, these skills develop not just manual proficiency, but patience, discipline, and an understanding of continuity. The wood teaches endurance, humility, and attentiveness. Carving also interacts with community and memory. Objects are not isolated. They inhabit the spaces and stories of the town. A palace door protects the royal household. A figure commemorates ancestors. A stool signifies status. Carvers' choices affect how people perceive history, ritual, and social hierarchy. The work is both private and profoundly public, shaping perception while remaining embedded in domestic, ceremonial, and civic life, even the slower, seemingly mundane aspects sharpening chisels, preparing surfaces, mixing finishes carry lessons. Precision in these tasks prevents errors and ensures longevity. In Edo culture, care in small actions reflects moral character. An apprentice who neglects sharpening or sanding demonstrates impatience and inattention, traits that may extend to broader social behavior. Craftsmanship, patience, and ethics are deeply intertwined in the streets of Benin. These rhythms establish a quiet order. Workshops occupy corners, shaded by trees, arranged to maintain airflow and light. Courtyards echo softly with tapping, scraping, and humming. Passers-by move unobtrusively, aware of the importance of quiet attention. Even in public, carving is a meditation, a balance of focus, movement, and breath. It teaches the broader community subtlety, respect, and the power of measured effort. The Edo carvers' work extends beyond the individual object to encompass larger narratives of lineage, spirituality, social order, and human patience. Each figure, mask, or functional item is a repository of meaning, holding lessons for those who interact with it. Over time, these works collectively form a visual and cultural archive of Edo society, one that preserves stories, moral codes, and social norms even as oral memory fades. Yet, the arrival of colonial influence, imported materials, and new economic pressures began to challenge these rhythms. European interest in Benin art increased, often prioritizing quantity and exotic appeal over ritual precision or cultural fidelity. Carvers faced the delicate task of navigating foreign demands while maintaining traditional practices. This intersection of global commerce and local ritual highlights the resilience of Edo craft, demonstrating how patient labor, cultural knowledge, and moral attention can withstand external pressures, though not without tension. The Edo carver's courtyard thus exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously: physical, social, spiritual, and historical. It is a place of labor, learning, ritual, and reflection. In each measured stroke, each deliberate cut, the rhythm of the past persists, quietly asserting continuity, moral engagement, and cultural identity. Apprentices absorb not only technique, but philosophy, the understanding that careful, attentive labor shapes both the world and the self. By observing these quiet rituals, one realizes that the Edo carver's practice is more than artistry. It is a meditation on time, patience, and human endurance. It demonstrates how ordinary, repetitive work can carry extraordinary cultural weight, sustaining history, identity, and community through generations. Yet, questions remain. How do these measured rhythms survive in an increasingly impatient, modernized world? How do carvers maintain spiritual and cultural continuity when the audience expands beyond traditional contexts? These questions hover over the streets and courtyards as the sun dips low, casting long shadows across sawdust and carved forms. Tomorrow, the rhythm will resume. Tools will rise and fall. Hands will scrape and polish, and wood will slowly yield its stories to those who can listen. The streets of Benin, once shaded by trees and lined with clay-walled courtyards, have witnessed centuries of continuity. Yet, by the late 19th century, they also became spaces of sudden, disruptive change. European colonial influence arrived not with the deliberate, measured rhythms of local life, but with urgent demands, new markets, and foreign valuations of what was once intimate, communal, and ritualized. The Edo carvers, masters of patience and precision, found themselves confronting forces that prized speed, quantity, and aesthetic novelty over the careful, symbolic practice embedded in their work. Yet, even under pressure, they adapted. Colonial officials, traders, and later collectors coveted Benin art, particularly bronze plaques and wooden carvings. The attention, while exploitative in some ways, offered opportunities. Skilled carvers were sought to produce works for export, sometimes in ways that diverged from traditional ceremonial use. These pieces were destined for foreign households, museums, or commercial markets, far removed from the spiritual and social contexts that had guided their creation for centuries. Carvers navigated this new landscape cautiously. They learned to balance local tradition with foreign expectation. The apprenticeship system persisted, ensuring that mastery, lineage, and ritual knowledge were not abandoned. Carvers still taught their students the subtleties of grain, the symbolic language of motifs, and the moral discipline of patient labor. Yet they also acquired new techniques, developed finishes suited to export, and occasionally adapted motifs to appeal to European tastes. The challenge was subtle: how to maintain cultural integrity while engaging with markets that valued only the visual, not the ritual significance of the work. In some workshops, the tension between tradition and commerce became a source of innovation. Carvers experimented with hybrid styles, retaining recognizable Edo motifs while adjusting scale, detail, or polish to satisfy foreign collectors. Wooden figures, ancestral carvings, and ceremonial objects were produced alongside new items intended purely for market trade. This pragmatic adaptability allowed the craft to survive economically while preserving core techniques and philosophies. The resilience of Edo carving lay not only in adaptability, but in rootedness. Workshops, apprenticeships, and courtyard rituals persisted despite outside pressures. Trees were still selected carefully, offerings made before cuts, and tools maintained with meticulous care. The act of carving continued as a meditation on patience, endurance, and attention. In effect, carvers were practicing a quiet form of cultural preservation, ensuring that the rhythms and ethics of their craft outlasted the upheavals surrounding them. Colonial encounters, while disruptive, also inadvertently documented Edo skill. Scholars, explorers, and collectors recorded the details of carving techniques, motifs, and workshop organization. Though these accounts were often filtered through foreign perspectives and priorities, they provide a record of Edo mastery during a period of social and political change. This documentation, combined with the continuity of apprenticeships, contributed to the survival of carving traditions into the modern era. By the mid-20th century, Edo carving faced additional pressures: industrialization, mass-produced materials, and urban expansion. Yet again, the craft endured. Courtyards adapted to smaller spaces or shared residential compounds. Apprenticeship systems continued, sometimes integrating formal schooling alongside traditional training. wood carving became a bridge between the past and modernity, a way to maintain identity, memory, and skill in a rapidly changing world. Carvers produced works for ceremonies, local markets, and international export, each object carrying layered meaning, historical knowledge, and moral discipline. The endurance of Edo carving is a testament to the power of patience and cultural embeddedness. Each stroke of the chisel, each scrape of the rasp, embodies centuries of accumulated knowledge: how to respect the grain, how to observe rhythm, how to translate abstract social and spiritual concepts into tangible forms. Objects created today continue to convey lineage, authority, and ritual significance, even as some enter global markets. The craft bridges temporal and spatial divides, connecting contemporary observers to ancestral practices at the same time. Edo carving demonstrates the adaptability of tradition under duress. By maintaining apprenticeship, community engagement, and ritual observances, carvers preserved essential aspects of their craft despite external pressures. They incorporated change without sacrificing identity, balancing innovation with fidelity to ancestral knowledge. The process reflects a profound understanding of continuity, that survival depends not on resisting change entirely, but on integrating it while safeguarding core principles. The streets of Benin today echo with the same rhythms described centuries ago. Courtyards host chisels, adzes, and rasps. Apprentices observe, ask questions, and imitate. Masters guide hands, correct posture, and transmit stories embedded in patterns and figures. The scent of wood, the sound of scraping tools, and the quiet murmur of instruction continue much as they did in the pre-colonial era. Visitors may see only the finished objects, the polished stools, carved figures, or ceremonial doors, but behind each lies a history of patience, repetition, and mindful labor. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson of Edo carving is subtle. It shows that survival does not always depend on grand gestures or rapid innovation. Sometimes it is the quiet, consistent, deliberate, axe-repeating strokes, attentive observation, ethical engagement with material that sustain culture. Edo carvers embody a principle often overlooked in histories dominated by conquest, politics, or spectacle: that attention, care, and slow, deliberate work are forms of resilience in themselves. In reflecting on their craft, one is reminded that patience is not merely a technique, but a philosophy. Carving teaches humility, perseverance, and attentiveness. It links hands to wood, people to history, and communities to the environment. The Edo carver's courtyard, in its quiet rhythm, is both workshop and school, temple and archive. It is a place where time is measured not in minutes or profit, but in careful, intentional acts that honor both material and lineage. And as the sun sets over the narrow streets, the courtyard settles into stillness once more. Tools are cleaned, pieces covered, apprentices rest, and the wood waits. Each object carries the memory of hands, minds, and hearts dedicated to patience. The rhythm, though quiet, endures resilient against external pressures, persistent despite centuries of change, and deeply embedded in the cultural landscape of the Edo people. Yet questions linger, as they always do in crafts defined by patience. How will future generations negotiate the tension between tradition and global demand? Will the rhythm of the courtyard remain as steady under the pressures of modernization, technology, and cultural homogenization? And, perhaps most quietly, will the lessons of patience, care, and ethical labor encoded in would continue to resonate in a world increasingly drawn to speed and spectacle? For now, though, the streets of silence hold their answer. Edo carvers continue to work, deliberate, and teach, one stroke at a time, preserving both the material and moral essence of their craft. In their quiet perseverance, the history of Benin is etched not only in wood, but in the enduring patience of human hands. The streets of Lagos awaken slowly, long before the bustle of markets, the rumble of boats, or the distant calls of merchants. The soft light of dawn slips between narrow alleyways and over clay-tiled roofs. It touches the wooden shutters of houses, the worn cobblestones of courtyards, and the bright bundles of cotton waiting in the shade. In these early hours, the city is quiet but not still. Within modest homes and courtyard workshops, women and men begin to prepare for a day dictated by rhythm, patience, and the delicate pull of threads. Cotton, the lifeblood of Lagos weaving, arrives in carefully gathered bales. Local farmers cultivate it with care, handpicking soft fibers during the dry season. Once harvested, it is cleaned, carded, and spun, either by hand or with simple spinning wheels. The resulting thread is soft, yet resilient, ready to be dyed, woven, and transformed into cloth that will travel not only through the city but across households, markets, and sometimes continents. In the small workshops tucked between homes, the looms stand silently, awaiting their attendants. Each loom is a structure of wood, carefully maintained, its strings taut, its beams polished by years of use. Some are upright, used for narrow strips of cloth or decorative bands. Others are horizontal, designed for broader textiles like wrappers or tunics. Apprentices, often children or younger relatives, sweep the floors, straighten tools, and ensure that warp threads are aligned before the day's work begins. This preliminary care seems trivial, but it ensures the smooth rhythm of hours to come. Looms themselves are instruments of patience. The weaver's task is repetitive, yet mindful. Threads must be raised, lowered, passed through, and pulled tight with steady hands. A single lapse can disrupt a pattern, misalign a design, or leave the cloth uneven. Speed is discouraged. Consistency and attentiveness are valued above all. The process is measured not in haste but in care, with the loom itself setting the cadence. Weaving is as much a meditation as it is a craft. Patterns emerge slowly. In Lagos, motifs are inspired by daily life, social structures, and spiritual beliefs. Geometric shapes, alternating bands, and occasional symbolic motifs representing family lineage, local proverbs, or natural phenomena appear as threads intertwine. Experienced weavers plan sequences in advance, mentally visualizing colors and designs. They work silently, punctuating concentration with brief hums or soft counting of movements. Apprentices observe, internalizing both rhythm and cultural symbolism, learning to interpret the subtle language woven into each piece. Cotton weaving in Lagos is rarely solitary. Workshops often house multiple weavers, each contributing to a larger project or producing pieces for different customers. There is a quiet collaboration. Assistants prepare threads, monitor dye lots, or adjust loom tension as master weavers guide the process. Conversations are muted and deliberate, maintaining concentration while transmitting knowledge, technique, and communal norms. Every movement is measured. Every gesture is deliberate. The air vibrates with the sound of threads sliding against one another, the occasional tap of a shuttle, and the soft rhythm of human presence. The preparation of dyed threads is a ritual in itself. Natural dyes, often indigo, red from hibiscus, or brown from bark, are used to color threads prior to weaving. Dyeing is a careful process involving repeated soaking, drying, and observation of color. Weavers understand the subtleties of temperature, exposure, and absorption. A misstep could result in uneven hue, weakening of fibers, or unintended fading. Knowledge of dye, like knowledge of loom technique, is passed orally from master to apprentice, reinforced through practice and observation in Lagos. Cotton weaving also serves as a social and economic cornerstone. The cloth produced in household workshops is both utilitarian and symbolic. Wrappers, tunics, and ceremonial garments are created for family use, religious observances, or communal celebrations. Surplus cloth enters the markets, where buyers evaluate quality, weave, and color before purchasing. Cloth carries meaning beyond its physical form. It signifies status, family identity, and social networks. In this way, the act of weaving is inseparable from community life. The patience demanded by weaving is mirrored in the rhythms of daily living. Weavers rise early to prepare threads, break for mid-morning meals, and pause during the hottest hours of the day. Social calls, errands, and religious observances are integrated into the workflow without disrupting the delicate tension of the loom. Meals are prepared and shared with care. Water fetched from wells. Children monitored for safety. Every act maintains equilibrium, creating a day that flows gently and deliberately from task to task. Even small technical details reveal layers of attention. Warp threads must be perfectly parallel. The tension even across the beam. Shuttles must glide smoothly, knots minimized. A single misaligned thread can affect an entire pattern, requiring hours of correction. In this way, the work teaches vigilance, discipline, and humility. Mistakes are instructive, not shameful, and repetition fosters both skill and patience. Weaving is as much a moral education as it is a practical craft. Over time, apprentices acquire a deep understanding of both technique and philosophy. They internalize rhythm, balance, and proportion. They learn to read threads, sensing when tension is uneven or when a pattern will misalign. They observe masters' subtle hand movements, learning the quiet cues that guide complex maneuvers. The loom becomes an extension of the body and mind, translating concentration into material form. The streets of Lagos themselves shape this rhythm. Courtyards allow airflow, reducing heat from the sun. Narrow alleys prevent distractions from outside traffic. Communal proximity enables shared observation and quiet guidance. The environment enforces the slow cadence of work. Noise, while present, is never chaotic. The city itself seems attuned to the rhythms of thread, shuttle, and hand. Weaving is also intertwined with memory and lineage. Certain motifs signify ancestral stories or local proverbs, A repetitive diamond pattern may reflect agricultural cycles. Alternating bands may symbolize familial ties. Through cloth, knowledge is transmitted silently, visually, and materially. Each textile becomes a repository of social, cultural, and historical memory, a record of life that is both functional and symbolic. By mid-morning, the workshop is fully alive with motion and purpose. Threads intertwine, colors shift, and patterns emerge. Each piece takes hours, days, or even weeks to complete, depending on size and complexity. The weaver's focus is constant, yet the work is calm, measured, and absorbing. Time in the workshop moves differently than outside. Minutes stretch, hours accumulate, and patience becomes a tangible, cultivated quality. And yet, despite this apparent quiet and ordinariness, the weaving holds profound significance. Cotton threads connect individuals to the land, the community, and cultural memory. The act of weaving sustains economy, social hierarchy, and ritual practice. The patterns themselves, while subtle, communicate lineage, belief, and social values. Every careful movement of the hand reinforces continuity, teaching apprentices not only to produce cloth, but to embody attentiveness, discipline, and care. As the morning sun climbs higher, shadows shorten, and the light glints on finished threads. The rhythm continues uninterrupted, a testament to centuries of craft, patience, and social cohesion. Each woven piece carries with it the labor, attention, and memory of countless hands, connecting the present to generations past. And still, questions linger. How will these slow, deliberate rhythms survive as Lagos grows larger, faster, and more connected to global trade? How will the delicate balance of thread, hand, and pattern endure in an age increasingly dominated by speed and mass production? These questions hover quietly over the workshops, just as the cotton fibers await the patient hands of weavers, ready to begin the day's work once more. In Lagos, weaving is more than a solitary craft. It is woven into the fabric of community life. Workshops often occupy shared courtyards, tucked between houses or adjacent to markets, where the rhythm of the loom is matched by the cadence of daily social exchange. The act of weaving, though physically repetitive, is deeply communal. Neighbors, relatives, and apprentices participate in a network of observation, instruction, and quiet guidance. Each person's role, whether spinning thread, dyeing cotton, or tending the loom, contributes to both the final cloth and the cohesion of the group. Apprenticeships remain central to this communal model. Young children, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, are introduced to the loom under the careful supervision of a master weaver. Observation precedes action. Before handling threads or shuttles, apprentices learn to recognize tension, understand patterns, and anticipate rhythm. Mistakes are absorbed as lessons, and patience is cultivated through repetition. The process of learning is gradual, measured, and intentional. The workshop functions as a school where knowledge is transmitted orally and visually, and where the lessons of diligence, focus, and respect are as essential as technical skill. Weaving is also a medium for storytelling. Patterns on cloth carry layers of meaning, encoding proverbs, historical events, or social commentary. A repeating diamond motif may symbolize prosperity or agricultural cycles, Alternating stripes might reflect the balance between spiritual and temporal life. Some designs are associated with particular families or neighborhoods, communicating lineage or social standing. Through the careful repetition of threads and patterns, weavers preserve memory, teaching the next generation not only how to craft cloth, but also how to understand the world around them. Each piece becomes a record of daily life, communal values, and ancestral knowledge. The social dimension extends beyond the workshop. Women and men who weave participate in ceremonial and ritual life, producing textiles for births, weddings, funerals, and religious observances. Cloth becomes a language of respect, identity, and belonging. A brightly woven wrapper for a bride, a subtly patterned cloth for a ceremonial feast, or a dyed shawl for a ritual offering communicates messages that words alone cannot. In this way, weaving mediates social interaction, marking transitions, roles, and responsibilities within the community. The patterns themselves become mnemonic devices, recalling ancestors, local history, and moral lessons. Economics also intersects with social practice. Surplus cloth enters markets, where buyers, often women, traders, and occasionally colonial intermediaries, evaluate quality, weave, and color. Transactions are deliberate. Haggling is measured, and value is assessed in both material and symbolic terms. The weaver's reputation is critical. A master's name assures quality, and the consistency of patterns and colors signals trustworthiness. Thus, patience and attention, cultivated over years, have both cultural and economic significance. In weaving, the ordinary virtues of diligence and care translate directly into livelihood. Ritual practice reinforces the moral and symbolic dimensions of the craft. In some households, threads are blessed before being spun, woven, or dyed. Dye baths, particularly for indigo, are tended with care, often accompanied by prayers, offerings, or quiet incantations. Masters emphasize that the rhythm of the loom is not simply mechanical. It is a conduit for focus, discipline, and spiritual alignment. A hasty hand or distracted mind can disrupt both the visual pattern and the deeper purpose of the cloth. In these practices, weaving becomes a form of ethical and spiritual education, internalizing values as much as producing material goods. Apprentices also learn about ecological knowledge embedded in the craft. Cotton cultivation, selection of fibers, and preparation for weaving involve an understanding of local seasons, rainfall patterns, and soil conditions. Dyes are often derived from local plants, and knowledge of which leaves, barks, or roots produce stable color is transmitted across generations. The craft therefore connects human labor with natural cycles, embedding environmental awareness into daily practice. The loom is a space where ecological literacy, social norms, and moral discipline converge in slow, deliberate action. Work is structured in deliberate cycles. Mornings are dedicated to threading looms and beginning new pieces. Midday may include breaks for meals or communal discussion. Afternoons focus on weaving, dyeing, and finishing threads. The repetition reinforces concentration and trains the body and mind for endurance. Apprentices internalize rhythm, learning to anticipate the loom's motion and to coordinate hands with shuttle and thread. Master weavers emphasize that control over rhythm is control over quality. The steady pace of labor produces both aesthetic and moral outcomes. Despite these structured routines, weaving accommodates flexibility. Social obligations, market demands, or household responsibilities occasionally interrupt work. A weaver may pause midday to prepare a communal meal, fetch water, or attend to family needs. The rhythm adapts without breaking. Patience is maintained even amidst small disruptions. This adaptability teaches resilience, demonstrating that the virtues cultivated and deliberate attention can extend into broader aspects of life over months and years. Apprentices evolve into skilled weavers. They internalize patterns, learn to select fibers and dyes with intuition, and develop a mental map of design sequences. The craft becomes second nature, yet the moral and social lessons remain embedded. Each piece produced carries a history of observation, instruction, and reflection. The rhythm of the loom reinforces values of patience, attention, and continuity, embedding these lessons physically in both cloth and body. Through these communal practices, weaving transcends utility. It preserves culture, encodes memory, and shapes social relations. Workshops are not merely spaces of production. They are sites of education, ritual, and identity formation. Each thread interlaces personal skill with communal knowledge, resulting in textiles that are simultaneously practical, aesthetic, and symbolic. The ordinary act of weaving becomes a living archive, sustaining social, spiritual, and economic continuity in a city undergoing gradual change. Yet, as Lagos grew, trade expanded, and colonial influence spread. These quiet rhythms faced new pressures. Imported textiles, mechanized production, and urbanization introduced challenges that threatened the slow cadence of traditional weaving. Weavers had to navigate these changes, balancing the integrity of their craft with new market demands. The challenge was subtle: how to maintain patterns, techniques, and moral discipline in a rapidly shifting social and economic landscape. The answers were not always clear. Some workshops adapted by producing cloth for export, adjusting colors, patterns, or size. Others focused on ceremonial and local use, preserving slow, deliberate methods. Apprentices continued to learn, guided by masters who emphasized both technique and cultural ethos. The continuity of practice, even under pressure, underscores the resilience of weaving as a form of social, spiritual, and economic knowledge. As the sun climbs higher, casting light across threads and finished cloth, the quiet of the workshop remains. Hands continue their rhythmic motion, shuttles glide through warp and weft, and patterns emerge with steady deliberation. The rhythm, learned over years and generations, persists as a testament to patience, skill, and the subtle power of slow, deliberate labor. Yet questions linger. How will these rhythms endure as the city grows, markets globalize, and new materials alter traditional practices? Can the deliberate pace of the loom survive the demands of speed, mass production, and modernity? Even as these questions remain, the loom continues its quiet song, and the threads, like memory and tradition, remain interlaced with the hands, minds, and hearts of those who practice the craft each day. By the early 20th century, the quiet rhythms of Lagos workshops began to intersect with forces that would profoundly shape the craft of weaving. Colonial administrators introduced imported textiles. Mechanized looms appeared in city centers, and trade networks expanded beyond local markets. 4 generations accustomed to deliberate, hand-driven methods. These changes presented both opportunities and challenges. The city's weavers faced the delicate task of preserving traditional practice while responding to new demands for speed, quantity, and uniformity. Adaptation became essential. Some workshops began producing cloth for commercial sale, modifying patterns, colors, or dimensions to meet the tastes and expectations of external buyers. European merchants, travelers, and later museum collectors valued Lagos textiles for their craftsmanship and aesthetic appeal, often disregarding the cultural and symbolic significance of patterns. Weavers learned to navigate this tension, creating pieces that satisfied markets while preserving traditional techniques, rhythm, and symbolism where possible. The act of adaptation required careful judgment, patience, and an understanding that the essence of weaving lay not in rapid output, but in deliberate attention. The apprenticeship system remained central to this continuity. Despite external pressures, masters ensured that new generations learned both technical skill and the moral and social dimensions of weaving. Children observed not only the physical motions of threading and shuttling, but also the ethics of patience, attention, and care. They learned to respect the materials, maintain tools meticulously, and treat each pattern as a repository of communal knowledge. In this way, weaving persisted as a site of cultural transmission, even in a context increasingly dominated by commerce and colonial influence. Workshops themselves adapted physically and socially. Traditional courtyard spaces remained, though urban growth sometimes necessitated smaller, more compact work areas. Apprentices and masters maintained the rhythm of daily labor, balancing household chores, market obligations, and ceremonial tasks. The structure of the day: early mornings for thread preparation, mid-morning and afternoon periods for weaving, breaks for meals, and communal observation continued despite urban pressures. Even amidst change, the tempo of the loom dictated the pace of life within these workshops. Dyeing practices illustrate both continuity and adaptation. Natural dyes, indigo, hibiscus, and bark remained central, valued for their permanence, subtlety, and symbolic associations. Some weavers incorporated imported pigments or mordants to achieve brighter or more uniform hues, blending tradition with practical innovation. Apprentices learned to monitor temperature, timing, and absorption, understanding that the color of the thread affected not only aesthetic quality but symbolic meaning. Blue, for example, might signal tranquility, status, or spiritual protection, while red could denote vitality, lineage, or celebration. Even minor adjustments were approached with care, reflecting the broader principle that every action at the loom carries layered significance. The social and ceremonial dimensions of weaving persisted alongside commercial demands. Cloth remained integral to weddings, funerals, religious observances, and rites of passage. Each pattern and color carried encoded meaning, family ties, moral lessons, social roles, or historical memory. Weavers understood that their work reached beyond physical utility. It shaped social perception, conveyed identity, and maintained continuity with the past. By producing cloth with these considerations in mind, even amid commercial adaptation. Lagos weavers preserved the cultural fabric of their communities. Economic pressures, however, were significant. Imported, machine-made textiles offered cheaper alternatives, often threatening local markets. Weavers responded by emphasizing quality, intricate patterns, and symbolic richness that mass production could not replicate. Master weavers emphasized that speed is secondary to skill and meaning. In doing so, they reinforced a principle central to the craft, that patience, deliberate attention, and mastery are forms of resilience, sustaining not only livelihoods but cultural identity. Apprentices absorbed these lessons both practically and philosophically. The repetitive motion of the loom, the careful selection of threads, and the precise execution of patterns teach more than technique. They cultivate focus, discipline, and endurance. Weaving becomes a form of embodied learning, where moral, social, and aesthetic education is inseparable from physical labor. The young weaver internalizes rhythm, learning to coordinate movement, observe detail, and anticipate errors. In this way, the workshop functions simultaneously as a classroom, a spiritual space, and a site of community cohesion. Cultural memory remains embedded in every piece. Patterns carry historical reference points, symbolizing local proverbs, ancestral stories, or social norms. Even cloth produced for commercial sale often retains subtle elements of these motifs, linking contemporary practice to centuries of tradition. The physical act of weaving encodes knowledge, ensuring that, despite urbanization, globalization, and technological change, essential lessons, both practical and ethical, persist. Modernity has also brought new possibilities for Lagos weaving. International interest has expanded markets, offering opportunities for preservation and recognition of traditional techniques. Museums, cultural centers, and local exhibitions showcase textiles, highlighting both aesthetic qualities and the patient, deliberate labor underlying their creation. Workshops continue to produce cloth for local use while engaging with global demand, negotiating a delicate balance between cultural fidelity and economic sustainability. The craft endures as both practice and symbol, bridging temporal, geographic, and cultural divides. Through all these pressures, one principle remains: patience is the foundation of survival. The slow rhythm of the loom, the careful attention to thread and pattern, and the deliberate cultivation of skill sustain the craft across generations. Even as urban life accelerates, technological change compresses time, and global markets influence local practice. The loom enforces a cadence that teaches continuity, resilience, and ethical engagement. The ordinary act of weaving, repeated over hours, days, and years, becomes a profound lesson in human endurance. The streets and workshops of Lagos today are quieter than the bustling markets that surround them, yet the rhythm of the loom persists. Children learn from masters, threads glide through warp and weft, and patterns emerge with deliberate care. The cotton fibers carry history, memory, and moral guidance, transmitting lessons far beyond the material object. Each wrapper, tunic, or ceremonial cloth embodies not only skill and labor, but also the cumulative patience of countless hands across generations. And as the sun sets over Lagos, casting long shadows across workshops, the rhythm slows but does not cease. The loom rests for the evening, threads waiting patiently for another day of attention. The continuity of craft, the transmission of cultural knowledge, and the cultivation of patience endure in quiet resilience. Yet questions remain, softly echoing through the courtyards. How will future generations negotiate the balance between tradition and modernity? Will the rhythm of the loom persist amidst rapid urbanization, mechanization, and global change? And how will the virtues encoded in patient labor discipline, attention, moral care, survive in an increasingly fast-paced world? For now, though, the answer lies in the hands of the weavers. They continue to work, to teach, and to preserve the rhythm of life through the deliberate intertwining of threads. Each piece of cloth is a story, a lesson, and a bridge between past and present, demonstrating that even in the ordinary act of weaving, extraordinary endurance, patience, and cultural memory can be sustained. In the villages scattered across northern Nigeria, the morning light falls softly on mud brick compounds, illuminating the thatched roofs and winding paths that lead between homes. There is a quietude here that is almost deceptive. Life within the compound is steady, deliberate, and carefully ordered, marked by routines that have been practiced for generations. Among these rhythms, the care of stored grain, the essential staple of Hausa sustenance, occupies a central place. Grain, whether millet, sorghum, or maize, is not merely a food source. It is a repository of survival, a marker of social status, and a focus of cultural knowledge. The granary, often a conical or cylindrical mud brick structure with a carefully thatched roof, is the heart of this practice. Its design is the product of centuries of observation, combining protection from rain, sun, and pests with accessibility for daily use. The very construction of the granary is deliberate. Thick walls prevent infestation. Raised floors reduce moisture, and thatched roofing allows air to circulate, minimizing spoilage. The work begins long before the harvest arrives. Families inspect granaries, repairing cracks in mud walls, reinforcing thatch, and treating floors with ash or natural repellents to deter insects. Every preparation reflects foresight and patience. A poorly maintained granary could spell disaster during the long dry season when stored grain sustains the household. In Hausa culture, the careful tending of grain is not merely practicalite, is a moral duty. A well-kept granary symbolizes diligence, foresight, and responsibility, qualities that are both social and spiritual. When harvest season arrives, the compound hums with activity. Women, men, and children gather the stalks of millet or sorghum, thresh the grains, and winnow them to remove chaff and debris. The process is physically demanding and time-consuming, requiring repeated cycles of lifting, tossing, and shaking. Yet there is a rhythm to it, a pattern of repetition that turns labor into a measured, almost meditative practice. Each handful of grain is treated with care, inspected for quality, and prepared for storage in ways that have been passed down through generations. The filling of the granary itself is an act of careful ritual. Grain is layered, sometimes mixed with natural repellents such as neem leaves or ash to preserve freshness. Women often chant or hum softly as they work, their voices blending with the rustle of grain and the shifting of baskets. The sound is subtle, almost inaudible from the outside, yet it permeates the space, reinforcing concentration and continuity. These songs are not ornamental. They serve as mental markers, pacing labor, reinforcing patterns of distribution, and maintaining mindfulness throughout hours of repetitive work. Organization within the granary is deliberate. The oldest and largest grains are stored separately, reserved for ceremonial use or seed for the next planting season. Smaller, newer grains are used for daily consumption. This attention to order is more than practical, it is embedded in social and moral understanding. The granary becomes a living archive, preserving knowledge of past harvests, seasonal cycles, and the labor invested in production. It is a space where material and cultural memory intertwine, each grain a record of time, care, and human patience. Social hierarchies are reinforced through this labor. Senior women often oversee storage practices, ensuring that younger family members follow proper methods. Knowledge of layering, airflow, and pest prevention is transmitted through demonstration and oral instruction. Children observe first, then assist in minor tasks, gradually internalizing both the techniques and the underlying values. Mastery is acquired slowly through observation, repetition, and reflection. Every act in the granary is purposeful. Idleness is discouraged, and attention to detail is praised beyond the domestic sphere. Grain storage is connected to community security and resilience. During periods of scarcity or drought, granaries become communal knowledge hubs. Neighbors may borrow or trade grain, and experienced elders provide guidance on distribution, ensuring that no household is left destitute. The granary thus functions not only as a physical repository, but as a locus of social cohesion. The management of stored grain teaches lessons in fairness, foresight, and communal responsibility. Pest management exemplifies the quiet diligence required in house grain storage. Insects, rodents, and moisture threaten to compromise stored crops, so daily vigilance is essential. Baskets and granary floors are inspected, ash layers are replenished, and damaged or infested grains are removed promptly. These small, repetitive tasks are not glamorous. They are slow, methodical, and easily overlooked by outsiders. Yet they are critical for survival. The granary, in its silence and subtlety, becomes a classroom for patience, careful observation, and sustained attention. Ceremonial practices also intersect with storage. Some grains are reserved for festivals, religious rites, or gifts to visiting dignitaries. These grains are stored separately, monitored with additional care, and sometimes marked with symbolic signs or wrapped in leaves. Their preparation and preservation carry moral and social weight. Neglecting ceremonial grain could disrupt communal rituals, compromise family honor, or offend spiritual expectations. The intersection of the practical and ceremonial reinforces the broader principle that attention, patience, and respect are inseparable in house life. Seasonal cycles dictate much of the workflow. During the dry season, granaries are inspected more frequently, and grain is rationed carefully. During harvest, the focus shifts to cleaning, drying, and layering. In planting season, seed grain is selected and preserved with meticulous attention to quality. Through these cycles, the household internalizes a slow, deliberate rhythm of labor that mirrors natural patterns. Teaching patience as a way of life, even daily consumption is informed by granary practice. Women measure portions carefully, preserving reserves for future needs. Children are taught how to handle grain respectfully, avoiding spillage, waste, or contamination. Every meal, though ordinary, reinforces lessons about foresight, care, and the consequences of negligence. The granary teaches, quietly and persistently, that attention to small details accumulates into survival, security, and moral order. The granary's influence extends to material culture as well. Tools such as mortar, pestles, and winnowing trays are crafted, maintained, and stored with similar care. Each object is used rhythmically, in coordination with human labor and the natural cycles of the grain. The household becomes a system of interdependent tasks, each reinforcing the slow, deliberate pace necessary for survival. Time itself is measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of labor, the sun's position, and the cycles of grain handling. Yet, despite centuries of careful practice, the system is fragile. Drought, infestation, or theft can disrupt months of labor. Families understand this reality and develop strategies of redundancy, vigilance, and patience. Grain is layered, inspected, and rotated to ensure longevity. Knowledge is transmitted orally, carefully encoded in practical routines, and reinforced by communal memory. The granary, in this sense, is more than a storehouse. It is a living system, a network of human attention, observation, and ethical practice. As the sun rises higher, the village hums quietly with the subtle motion of daily life. Children fetch water, women tend cooking fires, and men prepare for work in the fields or markets. Yet, in the heart of each compound, the granary remains a constant, guiding both labor and thought. Its influence is subtle but profound, teaching that survival depends on patience, attentiveness, and the steady accumulation of small, deliberate acts. Each grain, layered and stored with care, is a testament to human resilience and the quiet power of routine. And yet, questions linger in the mind of any observer who pauses in the early morning light. How will these careful, patient rhythms survive in the face of urbanization, climate change, or modern market pressures? Can the knowledge embedded in small grains and repetitive labor continue to sustain families when speed, convenience, and technology threaten to replace the deliberate pace of human attention? The answers remain unwritten, resting for now in the silent granaries, waiting for the hands, eyes, and minds of the next generation to continue the rhythms of patience, care, and cultural memory. In the villages of northern Nigeria, the granary is not merely a household tool. It is a central node in a web of social relations, community practices, and subtle ethical instruction. Grain storage, though appearing solitary or mundane, relies on interconnected networks of observation, guidance, and shared responsibility. While each household tends its own granary, families rarely operate in complete isolation. The community collectively upholds practices of patience, diligence, and foresight, ensuring that both survival and social harmony are maintained. One of the clearest expressions of this communal ethic emerges during harvest and post-harvest periods. Families coordinate labor, lending hands to neighbors, assisting in threshing, winnowing, or transporting grain to storage. These acts of mutual aid are not purely altruistic. They are embedded in systems of reciprocity, obligation, and social cohesion. Helping with a neighbor's grain ensures that the collective reserves of the village remain stable. preventing local shortages and reinforcing the rhythm of shared labor. Through such practices, patience extends beyond individual households, shaping the tempo of the entire community. Elders play a critical role in guiding these communal rhythms. They transmit knowledge of traditional storage methods, timing of harvests, and techniques for preserving seed grain. Their instruction is often indirect, communicated through observation, demonstration, and oral explanation rather than formal teaching. Children and young adults learn by watching elders layer grain, apply natural repellents, or inspect for pests. Through repetition and attentive observation, these practices become second nature, embedding both technical skill and ethical understanding. Here, patience is inseparable from moral education. Careful labor reflects foresight, respect for communal property, and attention to detail. Rituals further reinforce these lessons. Certain grains are designated for ceremonial purposes, gifts to visiting dignitaries, offerings during religious festivals, or seed for the coming planting season. Handling these special grains requires extra care and observance of ritual proprieties. In some villages, women recite blessings or chants while layering ceremonial grain, invoking protection, fertility, and abundance. These ritualized actions link the ordinary practice of storage with spiritual and cultural meaning, reminding household members that patience and attentiveness are not merely functional, but morally and socially significant. Even the material organization of grain carries symbolic weight. Older, hardened grains reserved for seed or ceremonies are separated from softer, more consumable stock. Layers of ash, neem leaves, or carefully chosen storage containers reflect a deep understanding of natural cycles and preservation strategies. Each decision where to place a specific batch, how to orient a basket, how often to inspecting codes, centuries of trial, observation, and communal memory. The granary becomes an archive of ecological knowledge, social expectation, and moral instruction, preserved silently through meticulous labor. Pest management, though practical, is a moral as well as technical exercise. Rodents, insects, and fungal growth threaten the integrity of the harvest, and vigilance is required to prevent loss. Daily inspection, removal of infested grains, and replenishment of protective layers are repetitive, unglamorous tasks, but their consistency is a measure of discipline and foresight. Children learn early that neglect carries consequences, both material and social. The granary teaches through subtlety. Small, patient acts accumulate into survival, while carelessness can imperil families and the wider community. Markets and trade networks add another layer of complexity. Surplus grain may be exchanged, sold, or loaned to neighboring villages, often involving careful negotiation and assessment of quality. Households that manage grain well are trusted partners, while those who neglect vigilance may face social censure or economic disadvantage. In this context, patience and careful attention have direct consequences for reputation, trust, and community standing. The quiet rhythms of the granary ripple outward, influencing relationships and shaping social networks. Women, who traditionally oversee much of the grain storage process, serve as both technicians and moral guides. Their labor combines technical skill, foresight, and social teaching. By demonstrating careful layering, meticulous inspection, and attentive daily monitoring. They transmit lessons in patience, resilience, and ethical responsibility. Apprentices, often daughters or younger relatives, learn not only the physical mechanics of storage, but also the virtues encoded in repetition, consistency, and long-term planning. Through these practices, household management becomes a conduit for cultural transmission. Ceremonial and communal uses of grain reinforce ethical and social dimensions. During harvest festivals or religious observances, selected grains are brought from the granary, prepared with extra care, and used to sustain shared meals or offerings. The timing, handling, and presentation of grain require deliberation, reflection, and respect. Participants learn that each movement, each careful placement, embodies attentiveness, humility, and foresight. The granary thus serves as both practical storehouse and moral classroom, shaping behavior, social cohesion, and cultural memory. Seasonal cycles further structure the rhythm of life. During planting season, households carefully select seed grain from stored reserves, balancing size, age, and vitality. During periods of scarcity, rationing decisions demand patience and reflection, teaching lessons in restraint, planning, and foresight. Even routine daily consumption is guided by awareness of quantity, quality, and timing. Through these cycles, households internalize a slow, deliberate tempo, cultivating skills and virtues that extend beyond the immediate task of storage. The granary also mediates intergenerational continuity, as elders guide younger household members through inspection, layering, and selection. Knowledge accumulates in subtle, embodied ways. Skills, ethics, and social norms are encoded in repeated gestures, the careful observation of patterns, and quiet instruction. In this way, the granary functions as a repository not only of physical sustenance, but also of cultural and ethical memory. Yet, despite these enduring practices, vulnerabilities persist. Drought, pest infestation, or social disruption can undermine months of careful labor. Households must constantly negotiate these uncertainties, maintaining vigilance while adapting to changing circumstances. Here, patience is not passive, is active, deliberate, and attentive. The granary becomes a space in which resilience is practiced daily, shaping not only material survival, but the moral and social fabric of the community. The Hausa granary teaches an essential lesson that ordinary, repetitive labor can be a profound medium for continuity, education, and survival. Each act of careful storage, inspection, or layering carries layered meaning: practical, social, and moral. The rhythms of daily work teach foresight, communal responsibility, and the quiet virtues of attentiveness and patience. Through these seemingly mundane practices, the community cultivates resilience, ensuring that knowledge, memory, and sustenance are preserved across generations. As the sun rises higher over the village, shadows shorten and the granaries stand quiet and enduring. Labor continues around them. Women thresh, children fetch water, and men tend fields. But the presence of stored grain exerts a constant influence. It enforces rhythm, patience, and reflection. And yet, as one observes these courtyards and workshops, a subtle question emerges. How will these slow, deliberate practices withstand the pressures of modern life? Urbanization, climate change, and globalized trade Can the quiet ethics embedded in the granary survive when efficiency and speed dominate economic and social values? The answer remains suspended in the morning light, resting in the patient, deliberate hands of those who tend, monitor, and preserve the grains, day after day, generation after generation. Over the decades, Hausa villages have witnessed profound change. Roads stretch farther, markets expand, and modern technologies, electric mills, synthetic storage containers, and commercial fertilizers alter the rhythms of daily life. Yet, within the quiet spaces of the compound, the granary continues to operate largely according to time-honored practices. Its walls, thatch, and carefully layered grain reflect centuries of adaptation, resilience, and human ingenuity. Here, the slow, deliberate rhythms, cultivated through generations, continue to teach lessons that extend far beyond food. Preservation. Modern influences have introduced both opportunities and challenges. Synthetic storage containers, for example, provide improved protection against moisture and pests, reducing losses and allowing households to store larger quantities. Motorized transport facilitates trade, connecting villages to regional markets in ways unimaginable to earlier generations. At the same time, these innovations can disrupt traditional practices. The tactile knowledge of inspecting, layering, and rotating grain may be devalued, and the moral and social lessons embedded in careful labor risk being overlooked. The granary remains a space where the tension between tradition and modernity is palpable, teaching households how to navigate continuity amid change, even as tools evolve. The principles of patience, attention, and foresight remain central. Elders continue to emphasize careful inspection, rotation of stored grain, and observation of environmental conditions. Children are taught to respect each step of the process, to recognize subtle signs of spoilage or infestation, and to appreciate the ethical dimensions of their work. The granary is thus both a practical and moral classroom. It imparts knowledge about survival while cultivating virtues of diligence, responsibility, and attentiveness. Ritual and ceremonial practice persist, bridging tradition with modernity. Special grains remain reserved for festivals, weddings, religious ceremonies, and seed for future planting. The preparation of these grains continues to involve deliberate care, layering, fumigating with natural repellents, and sometimes chanting blessings or reciting family proverbs. In this way, ritual practice reinforces the ethical and social significance of storage, reminding each household member that the care invested in the granary is both functional and symbolic. The granary also serves as a repository of communal memory, patterns of storage, methods of pest control, and protocols for grain distribution and code knowledge accumulated over centuries. Each family preserves these lessons in ways both tangible and intangible, in the architecture of the storage structure, in repetitive labor, in oral instruction, and in observation. Even as modern technologies supplement or replace certain practices, the underlying principles, meticulousness, patience, and moral attentiveness remain relevant, bridging generations and connecting past to present. Economic pressures, however, continue to shape household strategies. Market fluctuations, regional droughts, and shifting demand for certain grains compel families to balance tradition with adaptability. Some households adjust storage volumes, diversify crops, or integrate commercial solutions to ensure security and sustain livelihoods. Others maintain small-scale traditional granaries alongside modern methods, preserving cultural continuity even as they engage with contemporary demands. In both approaches, the granary functions as a site where resilience is cultivated through a combination of careful planning, observation, and patience. Teaching the next generation remains central to this adaptation. Apprenticeship, observation, and hands-on participation ensure that children internalize both practical techniques and the values underpinning them. The repetitive motions of inspection, layering, and rotation, though seemingly ordinary, train attention and focus, cultivating habits that extend to broader spheres of life. Through the granary, patience is learned not as an abstract concept, but as an embodied practice, reinforced by tangible outcomes, grain preserved, families nourished, and social obligations fulfilled, even in the face of climate change. The granary's principles offer enduring lessons. Variability in rainfall, shifts in planting cycles, and periods of scarcity make careful storage and observation increasingly crucial. Families adapt by rotating grain more frequently, monitoring humidity, and supplementing traditional storage with newer methods. These adaptations reflect a continuity of attentive labor, the moral and practical imperatives of care, patience, and foresight remain central, even as external conditions shift. The granary's influence also extends to broader social networks. When neighbors experience shortages or emergencies, families with well-maintained stores often assist, lending grain or sharing strategies for preservation. In doing so, patience and careful labor are not merely individual virtues, they become communal assets, sustaining social cohesion and reinforcing moral expectations. The granary, in this sense, functions as a bridge between material survival and social stability. As technology advances, the slow rhythms of traditional storage coexist alongside modern conveniences. Households may now measure grain using scales rather than estimation, or store larger quantities in reinforced containers. Yet the tactile engagement with grain, feeling its weight, observing its color, noting subtle signs of spoilage, continues to transmit essential knowledge. The granary remains a space of deliberate action where patience and attention are cultivated through repetition, observation, and reflection. The ordinary gestures of lifting, inspecting, layering, and covering grain embody lessons about resilience, foresight, and continuity that are difficult to replicate in mechanized systems. The moral dimension of this work endures as well. Observing grain carefully, preparing it for future generations, and ensuring it sustains households through scarcity teaches humility, responsibility, and ethical awareness. Children learn that their actions, no matter how small, accumulate into survival, security, and communal trust. Adults are reminded that labor, attention, and foresight are essential virtues in both household management and social life. In the quiet spaces of the granary, ethical education and material preservation are inseparable. Through all these dynamics, the Hausa granary illustrates the broader principle that slow, deliberate labor sustains both survival and culture. Even as villages confront modern pressures, global markets, and climatic uncertainty, The rhythms of careful observation, layering, and rotation endure. Each handful of grain, each carefully maintained basket, and each observant child participating in storage represents continuity, resilience, and moral teaching. The granary is thus simultaneously a practical tool, a moral classroom, and a repository of collective memory. As the sun sets over the village, casting long shadows across the mud-brick walls and thatched roofs, the granaries remain quietly steadfast. Labor ceases for the evening, but the lessons of the day linger. Patience, attentiveness, and care embodied in the simple, repetitive acts of storage persist as living principles, teaching the young and reminding the old that survival is achieved not through haste but through deliberate, thoughtful action. And yet, even as these rhythms continue, questions linger quietly. How will future generations negotiate the pressures of modernization while maintaining traditional knowledge? Will the ethics embedded in careful, repetitive labor endure in the face of convenience and mechanization? Can the moral and cultural lessons of patience, foresight, and communal responsibility survive alongside rapid technological change? For now, the answers rest in the patient hands of those who tend the granaries, who layer grain with care, and who pass knowledge slowly from one generation to the next. In these silent kitchens, the lessons of survival, community, and deliberate action continue to unfold, one grain at a time.